Welcome to the Director's Cut, episode 4, The Issues. I'm your host, Mick Larson, producer and director of the documentary series, What Would Jesus Do on Election Day? The Director's Cut brings on an expert from the documentary. That expert for this episode is Robb Ryerse. Robb is a political organizer for the evangelical organization Vote Common Good. He's also the author of Running for Our Lives, a story of faith, politics, and the common good. Robb and I will be breaking down the comments from the contributors of this episode. I'll be introducing you to the professors, authors, journalists, and theologians that have contributed to the documentary series. Don't forget you can watch the documentary series for free online at www.jd.vote. All right, let's get started with breaking down episode number 4. Well, Robb, it's good to see you again. Last time we were together, we were at your church when we sat down to interview for the documentary. How are you doing?
Doing well. Doing well.
So, as we're recording this, Biden has stepped down. Kamala Harris has been endorsed by him. What are your quick thoughts on that?
Deep relief.
Same here.
Yeah, and I'm excited. I'm more energized today for this election than I have been this whole cycle.
Yeah, I thought he definitely needed to step aside just so that we could give voters a good reason not to vote for Trump, for those that were kind of in between, whatever, especially someone younger.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, Robb, let's get started breaking down this episode. First up, we'll hear from Samuel Abrams, who is a professor at Sarah Lawrence College and the author of the book Disconnect, the Breakdown of Representation in American Politics.
So one of the weird things that we've discovered over the past 20 years is this idea of sorting. The idea that years ago during Reagan, you could be a Reagan supporter, support certain conservative issues, but very comfortably say you're a Democrat, and it could go in the other direction as well. What's happened in the last 20 years or so with the parties is that we've shifted from saying, I'm a Republican, I believe in these general values, but I can move around, to a worldview where if someone says to me they're a Republican, I can almost perfectly predict how they're going to review things. Same thing if you're a Democrat. They've lined up. So you have certain issues, whether it's gay rights, gun control, environment, and if you are a Democrat, I can tell you, what you're going to believe. Same thing on the other side if you're a Republican.
Robb, do you think this is even more acute in American Christianity?
Yes. This is, this kind of consolidating that we see amongst people, I think is on one level understandable. We have the phrase "birds of a feather flock together" for a reason. But it's also unfortunate because what it does is it's created, echo chambers where people only hear voices that they agree with, they only hear positions that they agree with, and all of it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so, I think we've seen this both politically and theologically, where people have just kind of become more and more insulated, and that's made them more and more solidified in their beliefs and their approaches.
Do you think there's a lot of pressure in congregations to, line up behind issues?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's very it's very just kind of taken for granted that, hey, this is what we believe. And I remember, when many, many years ago, probably 20 some years ago, I was much more conservative at the time and pastoring in a fundamentalist congregation and in the state of Michigan. And there was a constitutional amendment um, banning gay marriage. And I remember standing in front of the congregation and saying, regardless of what political party you're a part of, we can all agree on this. And and speaking in favor of that constitutional amendment. Um, and it was just kind of a given, like yeah, this is what we all think. And there's absolutely that kind of pressure.
Yeah, I can imagine. Next up is Professor Andrew Hartman. He's a professor of history at Illinois State University and author of the book A War for the Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars.
Somebody might have ended up a conservative Republican because of abortion, but they're in that milieu, and so they take on a whole host of other issues. Somebody might have ended up a liberal Democrat because they believe in the rights of workers to collectively bargain, but they're in that milieu and they take on a whole host of other political meanings. And so there's been this great polarization. Recently, some sociologists have discovered that a great number of people are quitting their churches because they associate religion with conservative politics. And on the same side, a number of people have joined religions because they associate religion with conservative politics. And so our politics are driving our religious choices, and our religion is driving our political choices, and people are incredibly polarized. And it's hard to sort of untangle the religion and politics from this. We've been polarized. We had a civil war. 600,000 Americans killed each other. We've been polarized. But we've also had moments in our history where we were much less polarized. The period between the early 1930s through the late 1960s, or maybe through the mid-1960s, I would argue Americans were less polarized. And I would argue that in part this is because we were collectively responding to international crises. The Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the early Cold War, when there seemed to be this existential threat or series of threats to the nation. It's also true that at this time period, immigration was almost entirely restricted, so that was not a source of division. It's also true during this time period that once we got through the Great Depression, the economy was strong and stable, and there was a solid middle class. And so there are these factors that are leading to greater consensus during this time period that start to fall away by the 1960s. But I think that, yes, we're more polarized now, and our media choices, our media possibilities exacerbate that. Maybe media has sort of fallen in, has served a market, has recognized that we're divided, and so has served a market, and that this then, it's a vicious cycle, exacerbates the problem of polarization.
You basically touched on this on your last comment, but also, what do you think about his comment about leaving and joining churches because of conservative politics driving that?
Yeah, I think that what I have observed much more is people leaving churches because of the conservative political push in those churches, and people feeling uncomfortable with that. Um, I am not sure that people join churches because of that. I haven't seen that nearly as much. I'm thinking about, polling that has consistently shown, and even some recent polling that has shown that um, Trump supporters will identify as evangelical Christians, but they also are much less likely to actually attend church. Um, and like that, there's an interesting dynamic there of there's an identity that exists without the expected associated behavior that goes along with that identity. And so I think it's much more likely that people are leaving churches because of conservative politics rather than joining them because of them.
I hadn't heard that. It's very interesting. Do you think then the 80% of evangelicals voting for Trump is not correct because of that?
Oh no, I think it's correct.
Hmm.
Um, it's just the question is whether or not they're church going evangelicals. And
Right.
I mean, some of us might argue, well, if you don't go to church, you're not really an evangelical. But
That's what I was thinking.
people have the right to identify, however they want to. And and I'm not gonna, someone calls themselves an evangelical, I'm not gonna argue with them about it. If they call themselves a Christian, I don't see it as my place to argue with them of whether or not they are. It's just, I think when you begin to break down the difference between the identity and the behavior, there are some behavioral markings that are missing. And I wonder if that contributes in some ways to why those folks tend to be Trump supporters,
Hmm.
lacking kind of um the normal structures, rhythm, routine, discipline of a church community. Donald
Yes.
Trump himself, not a church going man.
Yeah. Or even holding up the Bible correctly.
Yes, clearly never done a sword drill.
All right. Up next, we'll hear from Magumbai Joette, a law professor and the author of Exceptional America: What Divides Americans and the World and from Each Other.
What I suggest in my research is that if we look at the types of issues that people are clashing about, it's a much wider range of issues than in other Western democracies, because there, liberals and conservatives tend to generally agree on climate change, on universal health care, on abortion, on gun control, on many issues that here are explosive issues and seemingly intractable ones.
So, what do you make of the uniqueness of American politics compared to other Western democracies, Rob?
Yeah, there's several differences. One of I think the most significant differences is the election cycle in the United States is unending. Um, and other parliamentary systems, they dissolve parliament, call for an election, and it happens in 6 weeks' time. Um, that's not how we do it in the United States. And so, because of that, I think it gives the opportunity for extremism to come about because there's just so much time for it to fester and grow. I think we've seen, however, just like America has tended to import or export so much of its culture around the world. You see in Europe and in Canada and other places, there's been very conservative, extreme far right folks that have risen to prominence and threatened to rise to power around the world. And I wonder if that's, if they've been emboldened by, what's happened in the United States.
Well, I'd certainly, I can only think what Bolsonaro may have been in office before Trump, but it seems like
Mm,
everybody else came along after Trump.
yeah. Yeah.
All right. Up next is Jimmy Itzak, former director of church life, youth, missions, engagement at Second Presbyterian in Kansas City, Missouri.
There is still this death grip that I believe Christians have on believing that they are somehow are entitled to decide the direction of a nation politically. And every social issue that seems to come up seems to be a direct attack on conservative, evangelical, or just Christian worldview. And the problem is we as a nation are moving into this place where we allow, as we always really have, we allow people to have their beliefs, and those are protected, and don't hurt anybody, don't threaten anyone else's. And yet there's still this mission that politics is the tool by which we are going to help the world be like it needs to be.
Well, Rob, is he describing Christian nationalism or something else?
No, I mean, I think he's absolutely describing Christian nationalism. There's a bit of a misconception out there about Christian nationalism, that Christian nationalists want to convert everyone to Christianity by, maybe by force. It's not, I'm sure you can find some extreme examples of folks that, think that way. But what is much more in the mainstream of Christian nationalism is the idea that America is a Christian nation and was, born out of the imagination of God, was founded as a Christian nation, however that gets described. And as a result, Christianity should have a privileged place within American culture and American politics. It's not necessarily to the exclusion of everyone else, but it's that sense of, a Christian nationalist would not say, Muslim students shouldn't be allowed to go to public schools, but they would say, public school classrooms need to have the Ten Commandments posted in them. And so it's this idea of, hey, we're gonna allow others to exist within this, but the operating system, the general culture, everything's going to be driven by our religious approach. And so I think he's absolutely correct about that. It's that driving sense that my way is not just the best way, but is the primary way, the preferred way, really the only acceptable way for the country to operate.
Would that be Christianity is the state religion and there would be no separation of church and state?
Some would say that, others wouldn't. What's very common, a very common refrain in Christian nationalism is the statement that the state cannot influence the church, but the church absolutely should influence the state.
And you think the weird thing about this is like, you could say Christianity is the state religion, but there's conservative Christianity and liberal Christianity. So the liberals are probably out of this one.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Up next, Rob, is you. We get to hear from you here.
Yeah, gay marriage is a super interesting issue to me because it's an issue where public opinion shifted so quickly. There was leadership in both parties opposing same-sex marriage and marriage equality. And then in a short order, a drastic shift. And that actually gives me a lot of hope because I think there's a lot of people that recognize that, man, some of these issues seem like people are hard and fast and dug in. Public opinion can shift. And I think marriage equality is a really good example of that. Now, granted, there's always going to be those who do dig in and won't change, and that's a shame. But I think especially for younger evangelical Christians, a number of issues from the environment to immigration to gay marriage, as younger evangelicals get older, I think you're going to see a shift in the mood of evangelicals on those issues because they don't think the same way their parents did or their grandparents did about them.
Anything you want to expand on that, Rob?
I remain hopeful about everything I said then. And I'm also disappointed that things have not shifted more quickly. And certainly, the way things shifted on marriage equality, that happened very quickly. And I think that's a good thing. I would love to see that happen on some other issues, especially the environment and immigration. Um, and maybe abortion is one of those issues where, um, and I think we'll see in this election how significant the overturning of Roe v. Wade has been. Maybe that's a maybe that's one of those issues where we're going to see public opinion um, shifting much more quickly than we expected. Um, it's one of those things that people are like, yeah, I'm opposed to abortion, and then once it's taken away, they're like, actually, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. And we've seen that as a inflection point in our work at Vote Common Good. We've seen that as an inflection point, even with religious voters that are turned off by the extremism of those who want no exceptions at all, and the want to get rid of IVF and all those other things that has caused there to be some percentage of backlash against that amongst religious voters. And so I'm curious to see what happens in this upcoming election if we're going to see a similar kind of shift.
Well, when you have states like Kansas and Ohio, protecting rights to abortion, I think that tells you where the public stands on that, especially if you consider that 70% of Americans think some type of abortion should be legal.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I'm here in Arkansas, which is, a very bright red state that went significantly for Donald Trump. In the last couple of times he's run for office, and you know, we're in the middle of a battle to have a similar abortion protection measure on the ballot. And organizers were able to collect over 100,000 signatures to get that on the ballot. Now, our Secretary of State has held that up and made it more difficult to get on the ballot. Yeah, shocker, right?
Yeah.
But it's good to see that there's that kind of that even in red states, seeing that there's a lot of momentum on that issue.
For sure. And obviously it's impacted the last two cycles, and it's going to definitely impact this national election as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right. Next is Magumbai again. Same-sex marriage not only calls into question discrimination against gay people, it also calls into question patriarchy, because one of the driving factors behind homophobia is that it calls into question traditional gender roles. The notion that society should follow a model where the man is the head of the household and women are subservient. And once you start calling into question traditional gender roles, which is what homosexuality does, then you also are starting to topple patriarchy. And the people who tend to be the most hostile to same-sex marriage also tend to be extremely hostile to a woman's right to choose whether she should have an abortion, also to women's access to contraception and to equality for women in general.
Well, Rob, what he just pointed out about patriarchy really gets to the heart of the attack, I think, on women's reproductive rights and access to emergency abortions. And I think conservatives would love to also block access to birth control, if they could get away with it. But it seems it's not just about the fetus. It's really about controlling women. Do you see it that way at all?
I do. I think one of the other places where we can really significantly see this patriarchal approach is the attack on the trans community.
Sure.
And there has been a concerted effort over the last few years to really ratchet up the assault on the trans community by conservative Christians and conservatives in politics. And it's picking on, it feels to me like it's picking on a vulnerable group of people.
I agree 100%.
And And, but much of that is because of, a patriarchal system that's challenged by the mere existence of trans folks.
The thing that's amazing to me about that attack is like it's coming from conservative Christians or conservative Republicans that are conservative Christians, is like they are the most vulnerable group of people in our midst. And why would you attack those folks? And it's like the most un-Jesus like or Christian thing you could do.
Oh, yeah.
All right, it's time for some cowboy Christianity. Justin McKee is the pastor at Lenapaw Cowboy Church in Lenapaw, Oklahoma.
Can a Christian vote for a politician that is pro-gay marriage? Absolutely. He didn't have anything against homosexuals. I mean, he didn't have anything. He didn't say anything bad about anybody. It's like, hey, let's just get right with God. Let's just make sure that He is who you're focused on all day, every day, and not your own selfish desires.
Sounds like a great way of viewing the gospel, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things we say at Vote Common Good is, this idea of loving your neighbor is something that you do in the voting booth too. And, there's just a sense of like, listen, do nothing out of vain conceit or selfish ambition. The Apostle Paul said, but looking out for the interests of others, like that's, it's what Christians are called to. And that includes like how you vote.
All right, up next is Professor Leslie Smith. She is a professor of religious studies at Avila University and the author of Compromising Positions, Sex Scandals, Politics, and American Christianity.
Even though we don't see Jesus talking in the Bible about homosexuality, even though the Bible doesn't really talk about homosexuality except in a few, momentary instances, that doesn't mean that topic is not meaningful to a particular group that needs to use religion to suit its particular political purposes at a given moment.
Well, Rob, what do you make of that as far as religion being used for political purposes?
Oh, totally. That's the Christian nationalism is not a religious movement or a theological movement. It's a political movement that co-opts the symbols, the stories of a religion, in this case Christianity, to further a political movement. And so, like, absolutely, totally.
Up next is Magumbai again.
Many countries have same-sex marriage. This has not led to any significant social problems. Rather, it's improved equality, and it's part of the evolution of democracy to be more and more inclusive, even though there has been a resistance to it. And I think that it's important to understand that gay rights are human rights.
Would you compare the expansion of rights for the LGBT community to the idea that we are all God's children?
Oh, for sure. For sure. I think the story of the Bible is a story of human beings realizing that there is a ever increasing circles of inclusion that God has. And it's from the human perspective, it's like, oh, the people I thought were left out actually get let in. And ultimately to the point of the realization that maybe nobody's left out and maybe everybody's in. Maybe this category of in and out like doesn't actually exist. And so, for sure, that recognition that, everyone is God's child and valuable, not just to be accepted or tolerated, but to be welcomed and cherished because of what you bring to the world.
Well said. And I think you're going to say this again right now.
I believe that everyone is the child of God, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, and that everyone is valuable and deserves love and acceptance and life. Jesus just didn't reject people. He just didn't. Jesus didn't put people out, force them onto the streets.
So, Rob, when you say Jesus didn't put people out on the street, is that a more liberal view of the life of Jesus, or just the truth of the matter?
I mean, I would say it's the truth of the matter. You know, I don't know how well. I do know the theological gymnastics that many conservatives play with the teachings of Jesus. I How you can listen to the teachings of Jesus and not come to different conclusions than many conservatives do about what our world needs to look like and how we participate in it is beyond me. But I mean, that being said, um, there are those who let themselves off the hook with the teachings of Jesus, and it's really unfortunate. It's made the world a darker, more difficult place for many people to live.
It seems like in conservative politics, conservative Christianity, that Jesus is kind of the backdrop. It's not the primary thing.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and in the theological world, there, amongst conservative evangelicals, it's almost a preference to the Apostle Paul over Jesus. Um, and in my own theological journey, one of the things that really kind of reshaped how I view things was the recognition of the supremacy and the ultimateness of Jesus within the story of Christianity, that everything runs through Jesus, not the other way around.
All right, Jimmy is back with single issue voting.
Now, I grew up in a single issue voter home, and they were Republican, and we voted on a single issue. If abortion was on the docket, then we knew which way we were going to vote. And so it was always Republican, because it was the only platform that said no. And regardless of where you stand on that, since the late 70s, abortion rates have gone down consistently, dramatically over the Obama administration, for other reasons than just the legality of abortion. And yet, when we talk about these other social issues, how the poor are treated, Medicare, how veterans are treated, how farmers are, we talk about all of these different groups. It's like it's insignificant, their journey, their plight.
Well, Rob, conservative Christians definitely got what they wanted, which was overturning Roe v. Wade, with their support of Donald Trump. But, what did they have to sell and align themselves with Trump to get that?
Yeah, I would often paraphrase Jesus when he said, what does it profit you if you gain the whole world and lose your soul? If you gain the whole Supreme Court and lose your soul. So many, I feel like so many conservative Christians kind of fall into that boat. I understand. I'm kind of two minds on this idea of single issue voters. Um, I I think there's absolutely people who abortion is like they think of it that way. But you kind of begin to take a thought experiment of the person who says, like, yeah, I'm a single issue voter. I vote solely on where someone stands on abortion. Say, okay, well, let's do this thought experiment. Tomorrow morning, uh, Kamala Harris wakes up and says, "Listen, I have this realization that I was completely wrong on this issue. That life begins at conception, and we need to have a national abortion ban in America. I am no longer pro-choice. I am pro-life." You vote for Kamala Harris then? And
Well, yeah.
something tells me that most of those pro-life Christians are going to have other reasons why they don't want to vote for Kamala Harris. Um, And it might be guns, it might be immigration, it might be this or that. So I wonder if the single issue voter thing is not um, not something that some voters kind of hide under because they don't necessarily, it gives them the chance to be somewhat magnanimous in their minds, and yet at the same time, gives them cover to never actually have to support a Democrat.
All right, we are back with you on being pro-life.
If you're pro-life, don't you have to care about people's health care? Don't you have to care about how people live this life that they have? How can you be pro-life and be in favor of children being separated from their parents at the border? How can you be pro-life and support the death penalty? When there's proven that so many people that are on death row in the United States are actually innocent.
In 2024, Rob, it feels like to be pro-life is to be to roll back women's rights.
It's easy to point out the hypocrisy on the right, and I happily do it when I was a child of the pro-life movement, grew up in that as a conservative Republican growing up. I had a T-shirt that said "God is pro-life," and I attended a march on Washington in I don't know, a long time ago, 91 maybe, I'm not sure, I can't remember. And I was told that the abortion issue wasn't necessarily about abortion, but it was about states' rights, that states ought to have the right to make this decision. And then Roe v. Wade gets overturned, and all of a sudden we've got Republicans, who no longer talking about states' rights. They're talking about a national abortion ban. And so, it seems like there's a convenience to what people emphasize that highlights a certain hypocrisy. And, whether that's, pro-life being about just being, pro-fetus, or, what the scope and the reach of the federal government and people's lives, all of it, the whole thing is fraught with hypocrisy.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it in the previous statement in the documentary. It's like, if you're pro-life, don't you have to be, pro healthcare, pro social safety network,
Yeah. Yep.
All right, next up is Debbie Irving. She's a racial justice educator and author of Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race.
When I think about pro-life, I will go on the record saying that I personally would not ever choose to have an abortion. And yet I also wouldn't impose that through any kind of political. I think it is a personal decision. So when I think about people who are willing to take one piece of a politician's platform, pro-life, and center so heavily on that they're willing to just not even look at or consider the entire constellation, that tells me that belief to them is so deeply tied to their identity, their sense of self. Maybe in religion it's attached to an idea of, this means I will or won't go to heaven. I mean, religion is huge because it's not just, in many religions, it's not just about this world, it's about the afterlife.
What do you think about that self-identity, identifying with that as a person?
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's so many factors that go into, people's identity. And I think that, for instance, for many people, Christian nationalism is not a conscious identity. It's something that absolutely impacts behavior and shapes the way people live, but it's not like people don't think of themselves as Christian nationalists. it's a little bit like I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I grew up a Midwesterner, and that absolutely has shaped how I live in a variety of ways. It shapes, what I call carbonated beverages, and it shapes, how I interact with people and how I act at parties and all of those things. Um, but it's not a conscious identity. I don't think of myself as a Midwesterner. Like I don't get out of bed in the morning and say, "Hey, I'm a Midwesterner." And then I moved to Arkansas and encountered Southerners. And Southerners are consciously Southerners. They do wake up in the morning and think of themselves as Southerners. It's a conscious identity that also impacts and affects their behavior. And so I think when it comes to Christian nationalism and other political identities, there's for some people it is a conscious thing where they think of themselves that way, and others who don't necessarily think of themselves in those terms, but it still is an identity that shapes their behavior. And so I think there are those that have really, they've kind of take the Southern approach to the abortion issue, so to speak, and they really think of themselves very consciously as pro-life people, and because of that can't imagine doing or voting any other way.
I agree. And I've always thought this, that liberal Christians or progressive Democrats, what have you, are always going to have an uphill battle against conservative politics and conservative religion, because for the liberals, I don't think it's an identity. Where conservative, it is an identity, and they're very organized around the church, which obviously liberal Christians go to church, but it's just different. I don't know if you see that at all.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. One of the things that we often talk about at Vote Common Good is that for many people, they didn't realize that their religious identity and their political identity like kind of went together. It's a little bit like, ordering a meal at a fast food place, and you get the fries that come along with it. And you don't even realize, like, I could have asked for a salad. Like you just, and for many people, it's like, oh, I'm a Christian. And so the Republican identity comes along with it. And you're like, oh, I didn't even know I could ask for something else. It doesn't have to come along with it, but it does.
Yeah, there's no nuance anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right, we're back with you here again, Rob.
When you look at how the abortion issue has been framed, it's been framed essentially where there's two options. You're pro-life or you're pro-choice. And I think that duality, that binary approach to that issue, has actually done a lot of harm, because it's forced people out of nuance into these hard and fast camps. And I'm a person that doesn't fit in those camps. I, in no way, would want to restrict or limit a woman's bodily autonomy. At the same time, I'm also kind of person that wants to see there be as few abortions as necessary. And so I think for people that are pro-life, I would love for them to see that, like, there's more than one track. There's more than one option of being pro-life. It's not just I'm pro-life and that means Roe v. Wade has to be overturned. And I'm pro-life and that means strict constructionists need to be appointed to the Supreme Court. So there's just that one thing. There are other ways to be pro-life. So I'm pro-life, and I think that criminalization isn't the best way to reduce the number of abortions. So when you look at like the abortion issue, is the question its legality, or is the question how many abortions are happening? And I think how many abortions are happening is the issue, not the legality. And so what I, as a pro-life person, what I want to see is there be as few abortions as possible. So what's the best path to get there? It's not criminalization. Because right now, there's actually fewer abortions are taking place now than there were before Roe v. Wade was made legal. If you want to significantly reduce the number of abortions because you're pro-life, you're motivated by this, then Medicare for all, having a social safety net, making sure that we're fighting poverty and expanding programs that help people in need, handing out condoms, like sex education in schools, all of these things like that Christians vehemently oppose would actually make a difference in the issue that Christians say they care about. So I think what we need is an approach to this issue, like most issues, that recognizes that there's nuance. And so now I can be a pro-life person who says, well, wait a minute. I actually could vote for someone who's pro-choice because that person is going to expand healthcare and is going to expand the social safety net and doesn't oppose sex education in schools. And so even though they're pro-choice and I'm pro-life, they're actually going to enact policies that are going to bring abortion rates down, and I'm good with that. That's the ultimate goal. I'm going to vote for that person who's pro-choice.
Well, Rob, that was one of my favorite moments in the documentary. So thank you for that contribution. You're just making way too much sense.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it makes sense to me still. And from an electoral perspective, one of the things that I now in working with candidates for office talk to them about is like, listen, resist the urge to make this a binary issue, because if you are a pro-choice candidate and you make it just pro-choice versus pro-life, there is a significant number of people that you've just eliminated their ability to vote for you. But if you recognize the nuance, you recognize that there might be on a spectrum, 5 different positions about abortion, not 2. And I think 4 of those 5 would be open to voting for a pro-choice candidate. So it's a matter of how we frame this debate. And I think that, Roe v. Wade being overturned has given us the opportunity to talk about this again. And we've seen it with our work with Vote Common Good. It absolutely caused a percentage of people who are pro-life to begin to shift in their voting patterns. It's been an inflection point for sure.
Without a doubt. And I've always thought that the best line is basically that a woman's health and what she's going through is so complicated that there's just no way we can legislate it. It needs to be between the doctor and the woman.
Yeah. And what's interesting is polling shows that from an electoral perspective, saying this is a decision between a woman and her doctor is less effective than saying this is a decision between a woman and her God. That saying, and this has all been polled and examined. And so, when I talk to candidates about this, I said, here's the line to use. Say that this is a decision between a woman and her God. And that is a more effective line in terms of appealing to those people who identify as pro-life but might be open to voting for a pro-choice candidate.
All right. Magumbai is up again.
Yes, so there are many dimensions of American history that have contributed to these clashes. One of them is race. So America has historically been the Western democracy with by far the highest proportion of racial and ethnic minorities. that's led to more division in America than in other Western nations. So, for example, many of the people who oppose universal health care or public assistance programs tend to believe that these are primarily handouts to minorities on welfare, especially African Americans. And these sorts of racial divisions have really inhibited economic solidarity in the US. Whereas in Western European countries, because historically they were much more homogeneous, people, when they thought of creating programs like universal health care, they thought about something for them, for their people. They didn't think about that primarily for immigrants or for people of color. And in the US, the racial history, these racial divisions go way back in time, and they've had a much bigger influence in shaping polarization.
Isn't that interesting?
It's fascinating.
Where European countries see it for themselves, and here in the U.S., that's not how we see it.
Yeah, yeah. That is a fascinating observation that I really enjoyed hearing. Yeah, and there's some explanation there to the question of why people so often tend to vote against their own self-interests. And I think there's some aspirational component to that of like, okay, I'm gonna vote this way because someday I'm going to be a rich person who will benefit from it. Um, so I think there's some component of the quote unquote American dream being a part of it. This embedded racism um, that he's pointing out, I think, is a really interesting motivation as well, where there's people that are just like, nah, even if it would help me, I'm not going to do it if it would, help someone that I think of as other.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. All right, we have a new voice in Professor Charles Tabor. He's a provost and executive vice president, professor of political science at Kansas State University. He's also author of the book, The Rationalizing Voter.
Well, even in my own discipline, political science, in the 1980s, 1990s, a movement came up that said that, we were past racism. Race was no longer a significant force in American politics. To the extent that people opposed issues like affirmative action or welfare or other race-related issues, they did so out of principle. They were opposed to quotas. They were in favor of individualism and people, working and proving their value by hard work. These were all principled responses. So that was the claim, but of course they weren't, right? In fact, those were symbolic factors that just hid the underlying negative response to African Americans. And I did a project in the 1990s where I examined that and found old-fashioned racism, the beliefs that African Americans are lazy, that African Americans are less intelligent. These sort of basic beliefs from the 1940s and 50s are still alive and well across this country.
What he just said reminds me of all the effort currently going on, like to ban books, erase history, and reverse any type of equity and inclusion. What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective to maybe call out what might be an underlying motivation for many of those who had quote unquote principled reasons to oppose things that would benefit Black Americans. And it seems like it's not what we've seen over the last few years is that you mentioned is not just like, hey, we don't want to help Black Americans in any way, but also at the same time, we actually don't even want to know ways that we harmed Black Americans in the past. And that is a really unfortunate approach. That ignorance is only going to foster more racism and more division and more discrimination and pain. in the future.
I mean, that's the best part of teaching history in schools is learning what the mistakes that people have made in the past.
Yeah.
And what's fun about that is like no one's saying there's anything wrong with the current folks. It's just explaining the facts of history.
Yeah.
All right, we're back with Debbie Irving.
If I believe that, I'm very likely also invested in it in a way that fuels my sense of self and my identity. So to challenge that isn't just to challenge an idea, it's to challenge an identity, a set of emotions. It's a major project to challenge a belief system or even a part of a belief system.
Do you think that that belief system she mentions is, putting down the other to make yourself feel superior and thus derive some measure of self-worth from that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think she's right about how that identity gets challenged and the impact that has on people. People have this tendency where they don't accept facts. They don't you think about how people's minds are changed. It's very rarely that they get new information that, in some kind of rational way. Change happens much less clean than that in most people's lives. And changing somebody's identity, I mean, it's the hardest change of all. And so, one of the things we talk about at Vote Common Good is that we're not primarily trying to do identity change. What we're trying to do is behavioral change. I don't necessarily care what you call yourself politically if you identify as a Republican or a Democrat. I do care how you vote. And that's a behavioral thing. And for many people, what I talk to candidates about is you need to be an exceptional candidate. And what I mean by that is the type of candidate that someone is willing to make an exception for. So they say, oh, I would never vote for a Democrat, but I would vote for her. And that exception that someone allows themselves to make, they keep their identity intact, but they make an exception to that. It is the little crack that begins to let the light in. It's the first domino that falls so often, because what happens is somebody begins and then they realize, oh, the world didn't end because I did this thing I never dreamed I would do. And so, for instance, in the last election, here in Arkansas, a friend of mine who's a conservative Republican who's never voted for a Democrat in his life, sent me a picture of his ballot on election day, and it was filled. He voted for a whole host of people that I was just absolutely horrified by. And at the top of his ballot, he voted for Dr. Chris Jones, the Democratic nominee for governor of Arkansas, as opposed to Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And the reason he did that is because Dr. Chris Jones is an exceptional candidate, and he was willing to make an exception for him. What my friend doesn't know is that his ballot will never be as bright red as it once was. Like, the dam has begun to break, and like it's the purpleization of his ballot is underway. And so that's why, at Vote Common Good, we want to focus on that behavioral change. Listen, I'm not asking you to change your identity, just asking you to, vote for a Democrat this time. Giving people that kind of permission structure will have long-term beneficial impact.
All right, we're back to Magumbai.
Many of the people who opposed Obama's healthcare reform believed that its main recipients would be black people on welfare, even though most, or at least a huge share of the beneficiaries of the Affordable Care Act were white and employed. It's not only beneficial for the poorest of the poor. Universal health care is something that is beneficial for the vast majority of society.
I don't know if you heard about the book called Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl. But he interviews white men that need life-saving health care, but they don't want Obama's expansion of Medicare, Medicaid in their state, and the state was Tennessee. And they explicitly say they don't want expansion because Black and brown people take advantage of it, even though it's going to kill them because they need the health care, which you kind of already touched on. But
wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, that book, Dying of Whiteness, is really good. They split up in three different things: healthcare, gun violence, and education. And he just goes into all the ways this is killing white men.
Wow. Yeah.
So I highly recommend that book to anybody.
Yeah,
listening.
it's we're fond of using of quoting Paul Wellstone. We all do better when we all do better.
Totally. All right, we are back to Charles Tabor.
So that's why they labeled it Obamacare. That really, nails home the narrative. Again, but it does it covertly. Okay, that's what's clever about it, because you're not saying it's Black care, you're not saying it's African American care. You're saying it's Obamacare, and you're letting it's a subtle way to do it. And unconscious processes are always most powerful when they're covert. So some of those things that we were talking about, like gay rights, that's a threat. Like healthcare, universal healthcare. This is perceived by many people as a threat. And why would that be? Why would healthcare be seen as a threat? I think it's really because of again, it's an ideological interpretation, but an interpretation that people are being told what to do. They've lost personal control. Okay, so it is absolutely, in my view, a benefit, objectively, to have health care available. But if what we're doing is we're telling you, you must get health care, and you must get health care of this particular type, or you have to get it in this particular way, people will react to that negatively. So it's seen as a threat to personal freedom. And coming back to race, but I don't think we can forget that it was an African American president that did this, and so that again raises racism as a subtext to the whole debate.
I remember when they coined it Obamacare, I thought, I could just do a documentary on Republican code words.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Okay. Up next is Ellis Coase. He's authored 12 books, including the best-selling The Rage of the Privileged Class.
The racial legacy of America is to understate the complexity of what we're dealing with. I think because we are a very individualistic country, because we believe people make their own fate, because we believe that anyone can rise up by their own bootstraps, because we believe that there are good people and bad people and the good people always win, because we believe these kinds of things, we put a huge amount of emphasis on individual activities and individual acts and individual feelings, and so racism to many people is not what is called systemic racism, which is, why are certain people in neighborhoods? Why are certain people have jobs? Why do certain people not have educations? Which have very little to do with whether you feel animosity as an individual toward African Americans. But what we tend to do is to think, well, if I don't feel any animosity towards this group of people, then there's no racism, there's no problem. And because it becomes between you and me. If you as a person don't hate me, and then what right do I have to complain about racism to you? And there's a certain truth to that, in terms of interpersonal relations, sure. And I think it's laudable that as a country, we've become a country where it's much easier to see beyond race to a certain extent, and to just relate to people because they're interesting or bright, or because they share a common set of concerns that you have. And there's a huge but. We have built this country on a foundation of racism. We have built this country on a foundation of slavery. That foundation is still there, and that foundation affects what we have erected, above that. And trying to deal with that is much more difficult, because what that means is, okay, even if you as an individual don't hate black people, don't you have a responsibility to figure out how come people in one neighborhood are getting a good education and people in another neighborhood are not? And even if you are not personally racist, don't we as a society have some kind of obligation to try to ensure that people actually do have something at least remotely relating to equality of opportunity if they put in the equal amount of effort, and if they have aspirations, that they have at least the possibility of achieving that. So that becomes a question much harder to deal with in every way than the question of, do I as an individual hate Mexicans, or do I as an individual hate Arabs, or do I as an individual hate black people?
What kind of impact do you think race has had on liberal and conservative Christians?
Oh, well, I think it was Martin Luther King Jr. who described 11 a.m. on Sunday mornings as the most segregated hour in America. There absolutely, unquestionably. Listening to that commentary reminded me of a documentary that I watched relatively recently. It was an American Experience documentary on PBS about the race riots of the 1960s, and the commission that LBJ put together to kind of get to the heart of why are these happening and what do we need to do. And what was so fascinating about the recommendations from this committee, they were both, hey, people need to change their attitudes. White people who are racist against black people need to really understand why that is, and need to come to grips with that, and need to change. And certain systemic things also need to change, such as job opportunities, housing situations, home loans for black communities, all sorts of systemic things. And what was fascinating about the recommendations coming out of this committee from the 1960s is it was a both and approach. And I don't know, how many years later are we? 60 years later, we're in the exact same position. We still need both of those things. We still have not adequately addressed the individual attitudes of so many white people towards black people, and we still haven't addressed the systemic issues.
Well said. Up next is Reverend Gayla Rapp. She's the senior pastor at Asbury Methodist Church in Prairie Village, Kansas.
What's happening right now with race and the terrible things happening around the treatment of African Americans in our country, clearly we are a country that has not dealt with the deep-seated racism. Racism just embedded in our very being in this country. And we need to confront that sin in ourselves. And we're going to find people who find that political, or people who may disagree. I'm okay with that. We need to be in conversation, though, because it's a brokenness that will only be healed until we start to get real and get honest with each other about it.
Well said by Gayla. I've always wondered how conservative Christians feel about being in the same voting bloc as white nationalists and neo-Nazis.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's an interesting question. People hate being called racist. They don't like that at all. And I love the fact that she called, racism a sin. I love that framing of it. But I think you're right that, like, you look at the guilt by association, and they say politics makes strange bedfellows. Yeah, you see the people that line up behind the same person that you line up behind. You begin looking around going, are these the people I want to be associated with? And for whatever reason, many conservative Christians have not been all that bothered by being on the same team, on the same side as, neo-Nazis and very overt and overt racists and white nationalists.
Yeah, I've always found that amazing. All right, we're down to our last issue, misinformation, and Magumbai starts us off.
In some ways, this is a problem that's always existed. All human beings across the left, right, in the US and other countries tend to have a bias towards certain kinds of information and only hear what they want to hear. But the difference is that in the US in the last few decades, there's been the normalization of disinformation, which is a deliberate spread of false information. That's on a much wider scale than in other periods of American history and compared to other Western democracies. So the routine claims about climate change being a hoax, which are widespread among the Republican establishment, are commonly aired on stations like Fox News or other hardline conservative media. These are very peculiar by other countries' standards. In Europe, conservatives tend to accept climate change, and the media does not promote the notion that it's a hoax. So I would say that this is something very peculiar to much of American society. It's not even about conservatism per se, it's about a peculiar conception of conservatism that's emerged in recent decades.
So, Rob, as a former Fox News viewer, your thoughts?
I don't disagree. I just wonder if this hasn't just always been the way it is. And I remember several years ago taking a friend of mine to Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, which is an amazing art museum here in Northwest Arkansas. And as we were walking through this museum, my friend just kept saying, "This is propaganda. This is propaganda." And, as he was looking at different pieces of art. And I never thought of this American art as propaganda, but my friend is from Ireland and, has a much different perspective on things as a result of that, was not viewing this American art through American eyes. He was viewing it from a European perspective, and he was pointing out, look, this is the propaganda. And he kept pointing out it all through this American art, how it was used to foster and feed a narrative about people, a narrative about what American life is like, a narrative about, our perceived enemies. And, we think of propaganda as something, well, that's what the Soviets did, like we don't do that. But we do, and we have. And, what we now call misinformation or disinformation, maybe it's good old-fashioned propaganda, and it's been a part of the American story for as long as there's been an American story.
Yeah, that's a documentary within itself for sure. Up next is Dr. Alan Francis. He's a professor and chairman emeritus of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Duke University School of Medicine, as well as the author of Twilight of American Sanity, a psychiatrist's analyses in the age of Trump.
Thomas Jefferson said that you can't have a democracy without a free press. Donald Trump understands that. And what he has done quite successfully in the minds of a substantial 35-40% of the public is to instill the idea that they should believe this man who lies 20 times a day and has been lying his whole life, that they should believe this con man, this snake oil salesman, this serial bankrupt, this serial sexual molester, that they should believe him and his Fox News sycophants rather than the free press of America. This is a very dangerous moment in American democracy. The only guards we have to our fragile civil rights are a free press, free and fair courts, and the public, we the people.
Well, based on those comments, are you feeling hopeful for America or pessimistic?
Oh, goodness. Well, I will remain hopeful. Though I can see why there is understandable pessimism. Yeah, and I think Donald Trump's an easy target here, and certainly bears some responsibility. I think it goes back further than that. I would I would probably pin most of this to Rush Limbaugh.
I agree
um,
100%. Yeah.
and who had a business plan that involved um, providing an alternative to the perceived left wing or liberal media, um, and I think Rush probably is ultimately to blame for this, and what Trump simply did was really, as he does with so many other things, he made a really good, memorable marketing slogan with fake news, and capitalized on it. But I think this really goes back to Rush Limbaugh and significantly predates Trump.
Yeah, I think Trump just supercharged it, obviously.
Mhm.
All right, we're back with history professor Andrew Hartman.
What I think has become more apparent since the 1960s than at any time in American history, save perhaps for the Civil War period, is that there are these deep divisions in how Americans conceptualize reality. And we look at things through these particular lenses.
Do you think we're doomed since we all can pick our own flavor of news that aligns with our personal biases?
I hope not. Um, I don't know though. Because it certainly feels like not just we don't just consciously choose them. The algorithm learns it and feeds it to us. So, we don't even realize we're doing it. It's just that everything that comes to us is consistent with something that we already looked at, and and so I don't know what the impact ultimately of that is going to be, if we're going to be able to move beyond it or not. But it certainly is concerning.
It's definitely going to be an uphill battle for sure. All right, we're back with Magumbai one last time.
For instance, universal health care is widely accepted throughout the West, and people realize that it's much more cost effective and provides health care to everyone. And here, many people believe that the U.S. Healthcare system is much less expensive than those of other countries who suffer under the tyranny of socialized medicine. So because there's no common consensus on basic facts, it's very difficult to find a common ground for policy reforms. Another example is gun control. Some people believe that the more guns society has, the safer it is, whereas actually it's the exact opposite.
How are we going to get anything done if we can't? There's no common facts.
Yeah. I mean, that's the challenge. It's why elections matter. Because we're at a place where there's some people that are like, you just can't reason with them, and we've got Congress people that you just can't reason with. And so you've got to win at the ballot box. The way to disrupt this is to marginalize the influence that they have by taking away their political power. If Republicans were a significant minority in the House of Representatives, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and Matt Gaetz, Jim Jordan, and Ken Gosar and the Paul Gosar and the like would be much less worrisome. They're worrisome now because they're so close to the seat of power.
All right, up next is I'm going to combine two of these voices. First is Anthony Sewell, a photojournalist and documentary filmmaker. And then we'll hear for Professor Paula Loneide, an associate professor of comparative race and ethnicity studies in the Center for the Study of Culture, Race, and Ethnicity, and the author of Emotional Politics of Racism.
So you don't know what is real and what is not. All you've got to do is create a seed of doubt within the fact, one small seed. And once you create doubt, then you can disable the truth. And that's exactly how I think they have used the media in a way to, and the internet is very good at that because it's easy to do. You can reach a lot of people, you can create websites, you can create sites that tell people what they want to hear.
Again, with Donald Trump, you see he's masterful at manipulating mass emotion. And then the facts absolutely don't matter. No matter how many times we repeat them, there's this whole faction of people who just believe that people on welfare are, undeserving, or that immigrants are stealing our resources. So we keep saying to them, but no, let me show you how immigrants are actually contributing to the economic, pot. And it doesn't matter what we tell them. But there is this question that kind of emerges in this political moment, which is, can you actually talk to people who are completely unreceptive to actual reality? I mean, whose sense of reality is so warped because it's kind of bought into this repetitive sort of narrative discourse that has been put on long before Trump. I mean, Trump simply took it to the highest office, but this has been building for 40 years, if you really chart its history.
What Paula just said, the best example I can think of is how everyone has erased January 6th right out of their memories.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was, it was just, just tourists checking out the Capitol, like, wait a minute, what? Like we all watched this on television. We know what happened. These are not political prisoners. This is, yeah, for sure. And then, it's so disconcerting when you move to like the QAnon and conspiracy theory things where, people are just so willing to believe, this thing that they heard, or, whether it's got no basis in reality at all, whether it was, JFK Jr. is alive, or, the Pizzagate, or, the lizard people, or, all of it. Like, people are so willing to jump to those conspiracy theories. There's something so alluring about them. I know, like, I had to catch myself reading stories or seeing tweets about the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and like so easily could be like, oh well, was this faked? Was this like, it's so easy to move in that direction, and the misinformation just feeds that.
Now, again, that's another documentary right there.
Mm-hmm.
All right, our last voice of this segment is history professor Andrew Hartman.
So many Americans believe that the increasing number of horrible hurricanes are God's wrath. Well, then, what are we going to do about global warming if so many Americans believe that? It's a problem, because the most powerful political party in the world is really the only political party in the world that denies that humans have changed the climate and have warmed the climate. If some minor party in, I don't know, Portugal believed that, well, then it wouldn't really make a difference. But the most powerful party in the whole world firmly rejects the science of climate change. And it's because so many of the people who vote in this party believe that God sends hurricanes to punish people.
All right, Rob, does God send hurricanes to punish people?
I appreciate that analysis, and I think that there's a sense of that. I actually think that the reason I've got a different take on why so many Christians don't accept the science of climate change. And that is because Christians have been told a story about how the world ends. There's a whole theological system called eschatology, which is like the beliefs about the end times, how the world ends. And maybe people have seen like the Left Behind books. There's like a story about the rapture. There's a story about the second coming of Jesus. There's a story about a new heaven and new earth, and what the world is going to be like, and Jesus coming back to rule and reign. And there's some variance in what Christians believe about all of that, but all Christians have a story, a narrative about how the world ends that they believe comes from the Bible. And along comes climate change proposing a different eschatology. The world could end this way. The world is going to end this way if we don't do something. And Christians are saying, no, that's not how the world ends. And if I accept that, your story, I have to abandon my story. If I abandon my story, then maybe I have to abandon the Bible, and it and then the sweater unravels. So I think it's much more about a competing eschatology of how the world ends. And people working in the climate change space who want to move Christians on this issue really need to unpack that and figure out that. And until you do, we're going to see a huge percentage of Christians who just aren't going to budge.
Yeah, and it's a little bit ironic that that's not. I know what you're saying exactly, and that's how people think of it. But climate change is just going to kill a lot of people and make living harder in certain places. But it's not the end of the world by any means.
Well, I think that's how it's often presented, and how people hear it is like this is an existential threat and is going to kill us all. I think that's why like climate change needs to be talked about without hysteria and hyperbole.
Agreed. Well, Rob, we've talked about a lot. Any final thoughts on the issues that separate American voters and liberal and conservative Christians?
It would do us good to be able to have some conversations, to be able to talk about things. It would also do us some good to stop assuming about other people's motives, and let people speak for themselves and express for themselves what their motives are, and that might lead to a point of understanding that we desperately need.
Well, thank you again for your contribution to the documentary and taking the time to do this podcast. I appreciate it because your contribution is huge for sure. As you got to see yourself in the documentary, it was a great contribution. So I appreciate your time, Rob.
Thank you, Mick.
That wraps up episode 4. I hope you enjoyed the background and dynamics that go into the issues that separate liberal and conservative Christians. I'd like to thank Rob for his generosity of his time and thoughtful answers, both in the podcast and the documentary. His insights were really a critical contribution to the documentary and the podcast. I hope you'll join me for the Director's Cut, episode 5. We answer the documentary's main question: would the love and grace of Jesus align itself better with the Republicans or Democrats? Don't forget you can watch the documentary series at www.jd.vote. It's free and online. Thanks and take care.